Good morning, friends. I'm so glad to see you again on our third day of reading over spring break. Seems like we're going to have our break last a little longer, so I'm glad that I'm getting to spend this time with you. So today, our book is called Rainy Morning, and this is a book by Daniel Pinkwater, and it was illustrated by Jill Pinkwater. They have the same last name. I bet they're related. Hmm. And this book is also inscribed to Christopher. I need to dig around and see if I can find some books to my other children from my father. But this was given to Christopher from my father, so Christopher's grandpa. And the inscription says to Christopher, "Here's a different way to spend a rainy morning, different from Pete's a Pizza. I think you'll like it. All my love, OG." That's what my children call their grandfather. And he gave him this book in 1999, so that was also a long time ago. Rainy morning. It's not a rainy morning here in Florida. You can see behind me, it's a very sunny morning. But maybe we'll get some rain soon. I think that would be nice, but we'll see. Oh, look. Now, this page, this is the dedication, and it says to each other, DP and JP. Remember I said this book was written by Daniel Pinkwater and illustrated or drawn by Jill Pinkwater. Look at the little crows sharing a piece of muffin there. They're sharing with each other. Isn't that sweet? Mr. and Mrs. Submarine were sitting at the kitchen table on a rainy morning. "Would you like another breakfast, dear?" Mrs. Submarine asked. "I've had 2 breakfasts already," Mr. Submarine said, "but it is raining very hard. I will have 1 more breakfast, please, but just a small one." Oh my goodness, they've already had 2 breakfasts, and they're going to have another breakfast because it's a rainy morning. See all the plates and the bowls? And they've had their coffee or tea. "Oh, look," Mrs. Submarine said. "The cat is sitting at the window. The poor thing is all wet. I will let him in." She's going to let the cat in out of the rain. Mrs. Submarine opened the door and the cat walked in dripping. The cat sat near the stove, and Mrs. Submarine gave him a corn muffin. See, she gave him a corn muffin, and he's sitting by the stove. And you can't see this, but my daughter's cat has come up. So let me see if I can get him to say hi to you real quick, even though it's not raining here. This is Grumpy. And Grumpy is my daughter's cat. And my daughter is home from college because, like, they've closed our schools for a few weeks, or maybe the rest of the semester, we're not sure. They've also closed her college for the rest of the semester. So that means she will be home and not go back to college until next year, August. So actually she graduates, so she won't go back at all. So this is her cat, Grumpy. His name is Grumpy Guts. He's not that grumpy anymore. When he was a baby, he was very grumpy. Isn't he pretty? All right, Grumpy. Back to our book. So, the cat is sitting near the stove having a corn muffin. "I hear the dog scratching at the door," Mr. Submarine said. "I will let him come in and get warm." See the dog at the door? You're going to let him come in? What did they give him? They gave him a corn muffin. Look at that dog. Mr. Submarine opened the door and the dog walked in dripping. Mrs. Submarine gave the dog a corn muffin, and he took it to his corner to eat it. You know how animals like to go to their little spots to eat, their corner, their little area? "It certainly is wet outside," Mrs. Submarine said. It certainly is, said Mr. Submarine. Look at the poor horse. He's soaked through. Poor horse, said Mrs. Submarine. He doesn't look very happy, Mr. Submarine said. What do you think they're going to do? They've invited in the cat who is outside wet. They've invited in the dog. They're not going to invite a horse in, are they? Wait, can you already see the picture? What? Shall we let him come in? Mrs. Submarine said. Just this once, Mr. Submarine said. I will make more muffins, Mrs. Submarine said. Mr. Submarine opened the door and whistled to the horse. The horse walked in, dripping. I'm just baking more muffins, Miss Submarine told the horse. Oh my goodness. They have a dog, a cat, and a horse in their house on this rainy morning. There are some crows in the tree, Mr. Submarine said. Are they wet? Mrs. Submarine asked. They don't look happy, Mr. Submarine said. Crows love corn muffins, Mrs. Submarine said. I'm going to let them in, Mr. Submarine said. Oh my goodness, you guys, look at these crows. They're in the trees, getting rained on. And Mr. and Mrs. Submarine are going to let them in their house. Mr. Submarine opened the door, and the crows walked in, dripping. They sat on the backs of the chairs and ate the corn muffins Mrs. Submarine gave them. Look at those guys eating the corn muffins. Do you remember this part of the picture from the dedication page where the writer of the book and the illustrator, Mr. and Mrs. Pinkwater, had that the book was for each other and it was the crows sharing? It was from that picture. Do you remember? Let's look real quick. That picture was back on the dedication page where it said to each other, DP and JP. So now I'm thinking Mr. and Mrs. Pinkwater, who wrote and drew the book, are probably married. We could look that up. It certainly is coming down out there, Mr. Submarine said. It's an awful morning, Mrs. Submarine said. Would you like honey in your tea? I would, Mr. Submarine said. Do you know what I see outside in the rain? What? Mrs. Submarine asked. A wild coyote, Mr. Submarine said. As I live and breathe, Mrs. Submarine said. Is it wet? Oh, very wet, Mr. Submarine said. Do you suppose it would like to come in? You'd better tempt it with a piece of corn muffin, Mrs. Submarine said. It might be shy. Look at the wild coyote. He's outside getting wet in the rain. The crow's standing on the back of the chair watching. And I know you want to see this other page too. And that's just the crows still at the table. And I guess they've had enough corn muffins now because they're not eating these corn muffins. Mr. Submarine opened the door and showed the wild coyote a piece of corn muffin. The coyote walked in dripping and went to lie down under the sink. When I was letting the coyote in, do you know what I saw? Mr. Submarine said. Look at the coyote. He went in the cabinet under the sink. Do you see? They've got their cleaning products and they've got the pipe. And that wild coyote is just sitting there under the sink. But Mr. Submarine saw something else outside when he let the coyote in. What is it? Something wet? Mrs. Submarine asked. It's the chickens from across the street. They're huddled under a bush. Poor things, Mrs. Submarine said. Better let them in. I'll make more muffins. The chickens walked in dripping. They huddled in the corner as far as they could get from the coyote. That makes sense, doesn't it? Because I think coyotes eat chickens. I'm going to bring the car in, Mr. Submarine said. Have you ever heard of a rainy day like this, you guys? This is crazy. all these animals in their house, and he's going to bring the car in. All right, dear, Mrs. Submarine said. Be careful not to run over the chickens. Mr. Submarine drove the car in dripping. I can give it a good wiping with towels while we wait for it to stop raining. Mr. Submarine busily dried off the car while the cat, the dog, the horse, the crows, the coyote, and the chickens nibbled corn muffins and got warm and dry. Oh my goodness. Look at the chickens under the car. And he is just wiping his car down. Oh, that crow's eating a little more corn muffin, Look, do you see? A crow is on the pony's head, on the horse's head. And do you see the cat? You can't see the coyote from this angle. There's something outside, Mrs. Submarine said. I think it's a wildebeest. A wildebeest is a kind of mammal that lives in Africa. I'll go get it, Mr. Submarine said. The wildebeest walked in dripping. I'm mixing up more muffins, Mrs. Submarine said. Look at the wildebeest. Oh my goodness. You can look wildebeest up on the internet. It's spelled like wild E beast. Mr. Submarine looked out the window. Now that's unusual, he said. It looks like Ludwig van Beethoven is in our yard soaking wet. Oh, invite him in, said Mrs. Submarine. He's my favorite composer. Now, Ludwig van Beethoven is a German composer who died a long time ago. So this book has gone from where it could be real, even crazy real, to have a car and a horse and crows in your house during the rain. And now it's become what we call fiction, which is definitely not real, something that's made up, but fun. Mr. Submarine pulled on his raincoat and went outside. He came back leading Ludwig van Beethoven by the hand. Beethoven was dripping wet. Vielen Dank, Frau Submarine, Ludwig van Beethoven said. Would you like a cup of tea, Herr Beethoven? Mrs. Submarine asked. Bitte, und auch einen Kornmuffin, Beethoven said. Beethoven got a couple of crows to move to the back of another chair and sat down at the kitchen table. So Beethoven, I just told you, is German. He was a German composer, so he is speaking another language. When you heard me speak words that didn't sound like English, that was German. So he is speaking in German to Mrs. Submarine. And you heard that she called him Herr Beethoven. Herr, H-E-R-R, in German means Mr., and it's pronounced Herr, even though it looks like it's spelled her with an extra R. Terrible weather this morning, Mr. Submarine said. Ja, es regnet. Beethoven said that means yes, it's raining. Ludwig van Beethoven and Mr. Submarine looked out the window at the rain. Herr Beethoven, is that the United States Marine Band standing in our yard? Mr. Submarine asked. Ja, ich glaube, Beethoven said. That means I think. Yes, I think. I'm glad we bought 450 pounds of muffin mix, Mrs. Submarine said. Ask them to come in. All right, remember when I said we've now moved into fiction? Fiction is, it couldn't happen in real life. I do not think in real life you would look out the window in the rain and see the United States Marine Corps Band. The United States Marine Band walked in dripping. The bandsman shook hands with Ludwig van Beethoven and petted the horse. Corn muffins coming up in just a minute, Mrs. Submarine said. Look, Ludwig von Beethoven is saying hello to the band leader, and they're petting the horse, and there's a chicken. Oh my goodness, there's a lot going on here. And they're coming in, they're drying off. I haven't seen that coyote again. I guess he's still under the sink. Dear, there is a circus in the yard, Mr. Submarine said. Oh no, we do not have room for a whole circus, Mrs. Submarine said. It is a small European circus, Mr. Submarine said. Mostly tumblers and jugglers and clowns. The largest animal they have appears to be a small bear. No elephants? Mrs. Submarine asked. None that I can see, Mr. Submarine said. Well, that is different, of course, Mrs. Submarine said. They may come in. The small European circus walked in, dripping. Oh my goodness, you guys, they have invited a whole small circus into their house. Do you see the bear? He's up in the top corner. Mr. and Mrs. Submarine and all the animals and Ludwig von Beethoven and the United States Marine Band and the small European circus ate corn muffins and drank tea in the warm, cozy kitchen until the sun came out. And let's look at the picture. So you see the crow and I see the pony. One of the circus children is on the pony. Do you see that up there? And see a couple crows if you look carefully, in the bear. And let's go over to the side. Oh, I see the cat down here at the bottom. And the dog over there. The dog looks like he's happy to have so many people in the house, doesn't he? And look, all the Marine Band guys took off their hats. This looks like a party. I don't know that Mr. and Mrs. Submarine expected to have a big party in their house on a rainy morning, do you? I don't think so. But they did. They were very welcoming, and they welcomed people in who needed to get in out of the rain. And that is the end. So that was Rainy Morning by Daniel and Jill Pinkwater. And that was our book for today. And I hope you enjoyed it. And you can look up Ludwig von Beethoven, the German composer, and you can look up the animal wildebeest, which lives in Africa. And you can see what those guys really look like. And if you want, there was so much in this book to look up. You could look up where coyotes live and if crows like corn muffins and all sorts of things. So there's just a lot to go on there. I'm so glad we got this time together, and I look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow morning. Bye.